All right, welcome back, everyone. It is 11 o'clock, so let's get rolling into the final panel of the day and of the conference, which is strengthening our local food systems through law and policy. We'll talk about the role of food policy councils and the Certified Local Farm Enterprise Program. So for the next hour, we're going to be discussing, recent efforts in Maryland to assess the state's food system dynamics and to increase the ability of local farmers to access local markets. Um, the pandemic has really forced a refreshed focus on food systems, among other things. And as we've all encountered, supply shortages and shifts in market demands. So today I'm honored to introduce our speakers, our three people who have been instrumental in the legislation and programs that we're going to hear about today. So first we have Delegate Laura Tarkoudian from Montgomery County. She's co-written the legislation for the Certified Local Farm Enterprise Program, and she sits on the Maryland Food System Resiliency Council. We also have from Maryland Department of Agriculture, Karen Fedor, who is the program director for the new Certified Local Farm Enterprise Program. And last but not least, of course, we have Justin Hayes, who is Deputy Counsel for Maryland Department of Agriculture's Office of General Counsel, and he's been working on developing the regulations for the new program. So with that, I'm going to take myself off screen, and I will let you all you start your conversation, which will be kicked off by Delegate Tarkoudian. For the audience members, please put your chat questions in the chat box. Put your questions in the chat box, and we will get to them at the end. All right, let's go.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and it's an honor to be here. And thanks for the opportunity, and welcome to everyone. So I think I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of broader policy-based approaches we've been using to really look at our procurement systems and our structures, creating the Certified Local Farm Enterprise Program. So I'll kind of create that overview, and then I'm going to pass it to my co-panelists to talk a little bit about where the program is right now. And then I'll loop back around and I'll talk a little bit about the Food System Resiliency Council and where that is and some of the legislation that folks can expect to see coming out of that in the upcoming session. So to back up a little bit, I think a lot of these things go without saying to folks who are on this call probably, but I want to just kind of put the conversation and the policies that we're discussing today in context. For many years, many of the people in this audience, people on this panel, have been working to build a sustainable, local, strong, resilient food system. I think that we all understand that our food system is tied to a number of really important policy goals, certainly to local economic development, having strong economic opportunity, both with agriculture and value added, is important for our economies, for our local economies, for community-based economies across the state. We know that it's important from a climate change perspective to reduce food miles traveled. We know that it's important from a human health perspective. The more we can get fresh, local, less processed food into our bodies, into all communities, the better our health will be. And it's important for farmland preservation, that the strongest farmland preservation sort of policies are those that really ensure that local farms are profitable. And finally, one of the things that we have been talking about for many years is that having a strong, resilient, sustainable local food system is really important for emergency preparedness. And this has been a really interesting one because it's a conversation many of us have been having for a long time, talking about when we have some kind of national, international emergency, we will, there's a real danger to food supply chains. And I think that I've been talking about that for years. I've had people over the last several, 12 months, 18 months come to me and say, wow, I've heard you say that. I never understood what you were really talking about. So it's devastating that we had a chance to see, and even now still, to some extent, there's a supply chain disruption. We had a chance to see what supply chain disruptions look like. And really, the hope is that this becomes the call to action, and that we double down on our efforts to build systems that really ensure, again, both for for individual preparedness, for community preparedness, as well as for local economic resiliency, that we sort of double down on our commitment to building a strong local food system. So that's sort of the context and the background. The other piece of context that I want to offer is that I think for many years, there's been a lot of people advocating for, buying local, different buying local programs. Karen has been an extraordinary leader on the local, the farm to school program, among many hats that she wears. She's pretty remarkable. I'm excited to hear from her. But among many of the hats that she wears, she manages the farm school program. And there's been efforts to really grow and support schools to buy from local farmers. And there's been sort of, I would say, more promotional efforts to get state agencies to buy from local farmers, more so than concrete policy change up until the recent one that we passed. When we started looking into what was going on with local food purchasing from schools as well as local state agencies, right? It seems pretty obvious. Most of my colleagues would agree, like, yeah, we should take state money and we should use it to buy food from farmers if we want, a local farm system to function. But there's a couple of things that are going on when we look at that. One of the issues, of course, is this issue of aggregation and distribution systems. And so when you have a prison that is taking on, putting out procurement, and the procurement is being bid on by, say, Aramark, an Aramark subcontractor is Sysco, and Sysco has an entire trucking system that is based on bringing in food from California. Even if the prison wanted to buy from local farmers, it's very hard for those local farmers to get into that system that is the Sysco system, right? I'd say it's not happening at all, but it becomes very difficult to do that. And so it became clear that we needed to sort of restructure the way that procurement was happening, that the sort of lip service promotion to, we really want our agencies to buy local, just kind of isn't working with the systems that are in place. The second thing, though, that we found is that to the extent that there is local purchasing happening, we often see the local purchasing happening to neighboring states. And so we have, the reality is this: we have Maryland farmers work with Maryland nutrient management requirements, and Maryland has one of the strongest nutrient management requirements certainly in the Mid-Atlantic region. And I believe in those requirements and I support those requirements, but we also need to recognize that what we're doing is we're asking our Maryland farmers to internalize the externalities of the impact on the Bay. And so once we recognize that, we need to be able to and willing to prioritize purchasing from those very same farmers that we've asked to internalize those externalities. And what we see is that often we have school systems that are doing sort of buy local programs, but the local that they're buying from is Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina farms. And so we started looking at what can we do about this, and specifically what can we do about this given that we also have an interstate commerce clause. And so from a constitutional perspective, we can't say our local purchasing program is only for Maryland farms. And so what we did was, there's a few things that we did in the legislation that we passed in 2020. The first is that we established what we call the Certified Local Farm Enterprise Program. And anyone could be a member of the Certified Local Farm Enterprise Program. Any farm could be a member if they meet the Maryland nutrient management requirements. And so what that means is that automatically every Maryland farm is eligible with just checking the box, and Karen will talk a little bit more about this process, to be in that program. It also means that if a Pennsylvania farm chose to meet Maryland's nutrient management standards, they could apply and they could be part of it. And so what that does is it says we are prioritizing investing our state food money into farms that meet the same standards that we require of all of our Maryland farmers, which is internalizing the impacts of the impacts on the Bay. And so it's a way to, and it also ends up being constitutional. And Justin can speak to that in a moment, because we aren't sort of using an arbitrary state line. We're using a set of qualitative standards about what kind of farming we're trying to support. So that's the first thing that we do. So setting that office up. And then once that office is there, once we have that standard in place, we have the ability to direct all of our procurement processes to require that every subcontractor, every contractor who is applying to be a food provider to a Maryland state agency has to demonstrate that they have attempted to purchase 20%, and it's a stretch goal, 20%, but that's our goal. They demonstrate that they've attempted to purchase 20% from certified local farmers. And so what that does is it puts the pressure, if Aramark wants that contract, if Cisco wants that contract, it puts the pressure on them to engage with Maryland farmers. Now, we recognize that there's other things that will need to be done, that it'll be an iterative process. To get sort of from here to there, but by forcing that procurement process to move in that direction, it also gives us the chance to gather information. So there are people who think that maybe there's a pricing differential, and that pricing differential is really the challenge. We don't know that for sure because we haven't seen. We actually, by the way, have an ability for procurement for 5% more for local purchasing. But we don't know yet if that's the right amount, if that 5% differential is the right amount, if we need more, because we haven't actually seen an attempt to do this procurement. So part of what we'll get as this process begins is an opportunity to see and gather information. What are the additional barriers? We do know that one of the barriers is aggregation. And so the second thing that this bill did is that it established a fund within Marbidco for a grant fund for infrastructure for aggregation to support multiple small, medium-sized farmers to be able to physically aggregate their product for the purpose of selling to institutions. So all of this we passed the bill in 2020, it was vetoed, we overrode the veto in 2021. And so now over the last several months, this has kind of been being developed. And so that's some of the background. I'm gonna stop here so you all can talk a little bit about that, and then I'll jump back in and talk about like what are our next steps, where are we taking kind of next steps on policy in this broader area. Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate. Justin, do you want to go next, or I could talk about the program, a little bit about the program?
Yeah, I can touch upon some things about where we are. I was going to talk about the regulations, but before I go there, probably the best thing to do, and I'm assuming my mic is on here. Yeah. Why don't you talk about the program generally and just sort of some of the structural things that we're dealing with right now and how it's going to be set up. And then once we talk about that, I'll sort of get into where we stand with the regulations, which was required by the legislation. So
okay.
Go ahead and do that, Karen.
Yeah, that would be great. Megan, let me, I'll say a few words, and then if you could bring up the PowerPoint. Not just yet, but soon. So thank you, Delegate, and for your intro. That was extremely helpful. And so as taking on this program within the Maryland Department of Agriculture, yes, I've had some experience with the farm to school and procurement, and you are, Delegate, what you're doing is you're highlighting the importance of procurement, because that is essentially where the systematic change can take place. And when you talk about procurement, especially from a government agency perspective, I know a lot of eye rolls, and people eyes glaze over and they don't understand what does that mean. And it's a whole process within itself. I thought I knew procurement from just my experience with the farm to school program on the federal level, but working on this program on the state level, it's different. Yes, there are some similarities, and there's a steep learning curve, and I am in that process of that steep learning curve right now. And fortunately, we do have some great expertise within the state that have been very helpful as we start going through this process. But working within Maryland Department of Agriculture and the Certified Local Farm Enterprise, because as you mentioned, with the legislation, there's a 20% mandated goal to buy 20% of local food product, 20% of the food product from the Certified Local Farm Enterprises. So what we decided to do is break this program down into two parts. One is let's get the farmers on board, because it's a chicken or egg kind of scenario. How do you get the buyers interested, saying, look at what we have available in Maryland, when they say, well, what do you have available in Maryland? Or what is the seasonality? That's often the case, what we hear from a program perspective. So we decided to say, okay, well, let's get the farmers on board first. And then we could go to our buyers. Essentially, the state agencies are our buyers and say, look what we have available. So that's the process that we're working on right now. Is we've developed a form. It's on Maryland's website, MDA's website. And we want, so if the farmers are out there, please sign up to become part of the Certified Local Farm Enterprise Program if you're interested in selling to state institutions. And so so we created this form, and I've also worked with our nutrient management staff as part of the program. You have to have the nutrient management requirements. And so it's been a great collaborative partnership within MDA of working with the nutrient management staff to figure out, when the farmers do apply, are they eligible? Can they receive certification? And it's, as I said, it's been a learning process. What we are finding out is some of the farmers out there do not realize that they need to meet nutrient management plans. And so we are asking them to fill out a nutrient management plan if they meet the requirements. That has been a learning lesson on all of our parts, but it's been, and the farmers they didn't know, but that's been a good learning lesson. From there, once you are become certified, part of the legislation is that you are on a directory, a public directory. And so that is currently on MDA's website. What I'm excited to see is that we have Maryland, the state of Maryland is transitioning a lot of their forms onto One Stop. And so from there, it has been a priority for the agency to get this public directory onto One Stop. So what I want to do now is just go quickly review the One Stop form for the farmers out there, or if anybody knows anybody who is a farmer. This will go live in December. And so essentially what you want to do is to go to the One Stop form, which you'll see up there. And then you click on the Certified Local Farm Enterprise. You'll go to the next slide. Okay. And then from there, and it's really simple. What we want to do is we want to make it really easy for anyone who is eligible to apply. And so if you already are on One Stop, then you kind of are familiar with the process. And if you're not, you have to create a login, but it's super easy. And then the form will just take you through the various questions, whether or not you have a nutrient management plan, if you're applying on behalf of somebody. That's what we're seeing is people will apply on behalf of another farm, and so so that's been interesting process. And from there, what we'll do is once you submit your application, you'll go through the various processes of being reviewed by myself, by the office, and then also by our nutrient management staff. And then if you are approved, then you'll be put onto the public directory, which I think is the next slide. Oh, that's right. That's just the form in which what you'll see is once you'll just go through the process and see if it's correct. That's the type of information that we're asking from you. And it's really simple. It's just contact name, farm name, what are the products, the type of products that you're selling, that you're interested in selling to a state institution. And then from there, once you're certified, there you go. Then that's going to be our public directory. The legislation is very, it outlines what is needed in terms of the public directory. And I think we meet the intent of the legislation with our public directory. So we're trying to keep it simple for everyone who's involved, but yet have the credibility of the program, because yes, we do want to show our institutional buyers that our farmers do have their nutrient management, that they do meet the nutrient management requirements, which are very important. And I think that's it. Yes. And as I said, it will go live in December. So as I said, it's a steep learning curve. Fortunately, we are in the process of, I think we should announce it next week, because the legislation did allow for 2 staff, and we're very happy to be able to announce those positions. and there was funding available, which is extremely important in order to be able to implement the program. So yes, we are. It's a slow startup, but I think we've reached the top of our learning curve, and in terms of we could accelerate from there. Because again, looking at state institution wise, it's a big task, and so we have to break it down into, a longer view, because it is an ambitious program. And so yes, we're like 6 months into the program, but yet, where are we going to be from 5 years from now, right? And how much change is going to happen because of the steps that we're taking now. So, Justin?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the thanks, Karen, for that overlay and sort of how everything's going to work. Most of the policy has been covered as for the reasons of why this program is put in place. The delegate sort of hit the high points. What I sort of want to talk about is the mechanics of the regulations. Now, it's probably most people know when there's a new program developed or a statute puts a new program into place. Just getting a note here. The General Assembly mandates regulations be promulgated, and the legislation gives the general framework of what the policy is, which Delegate Charkoudian talked about, and the regulations, as most people know, is sort of where the rubber hits the road, where we say, okay, well, here's the policy, but how are we actually going to implement this and work the program on a day-to-day basis? And so this statute came across my desk last spring, where Mark said, and for those who are familiar with this program, and probably the delegate and maybe Carrie can speak to this a little bit more, I think when the statute was originally approved by the General Assembly, it was vetoed, and then there was a veto override. So this program sort of had some fits and starts. And Mark contacted me and said, looks like this program's going to go into place. We need to get these regulations put together. So I sat down and, like most new programs and legislation, I sat down and looked at it and I said, well, what's the goal here of the program? And Delegate Charkoudian's already, mentioned a lot of the, the purpose is to get the 20% to buy local. And one of the things that was pretty obvious to me when looking through the legislation that we're talking about 5 years from now, where is this program going to be? The one trigger to be a certified local farm enterprise program, or not trigger, but the qualification, and I'm just pulled up the bill here, is and I'm just reading from, the subtitle is captioned as Certified Local Farm Enterprise Program, and this is under 14701 under the definitions section. And it says a certified local farm enterprise means a local farm enterprise that, one, meets the nutrient, and that's sort of the key term here, meets the nutrient management requirements established under Title 8, Subtitle 8 of the Agriculture Article, and two, is certified by the department in accordance with regulations adopted under the subtitle. And when I say, meets is sort of the key term here, as I'm reading this, a couple months ago, I'm thinking, does that mean you actually have to have one? And these sort of questions pop up, and I say, well, what happens if, you're the type of business entity that doesn't need a nutrient management plan? And so, for example, apiaries come into question and or come to mind. And what about aquaculture, where you're not going to need a nutrient management plan? So, these are the types of things that we're sort of, until the program gets put into place, we're not going to know. We're going to have to make some adjustments going forward, because there are definitely some farmers that are going to have commodities that are going to want to sell to the state and get the benefit of the purchasers, the state agencies having to buy from them. But we're just going to have to figure out how to get them into the market. But the other question that sort of came up here was, well, what happens if the delegate had mentioned, I'm in Pennsylvania, or if I'm in Delaware, or if I'm in Virginia, and I can't get a nutrient management plan because the state doesn't issue those to out-of-state businesses. And I kind of went, and I had to do a little bit of homework on this, and I went to Dwight Dodder and said, does the state of Maryland issue nutrient management plans to anybody outside of the state? And the answer was no. So if you take a look at the statute closely, it does not require that they have a nutrient management plan. It's just that they satisfy the requirements. And this sort of ties into what Delegate Charkoudian was talking about before, and that's sort of the constitutional argument of, we're not excluding anybody outside of the state of Maryland to participate in our markets, but we're saying if you want the benefit of market participation in Maryland, you are going to be up to the same standards of the nutrient management plan requirements that in-state farmers are going to have to satisfy to ensure that they are, and I'm not going to pretend to know the science of this, and the delegate probably can talk a lot more than I can, but we don't want you getting access to our markets at an advantage to in-state farmers who have to satisfy the nutrient management requirements and are protecting the bay. But if you're in Pennsylvania, you don't have to satisfy those requirements, and you can still get access to our markets without having to satisfy the protection requirements that might, through the nutrient management plan, that will protect the Chesapeake Bay. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, as I was drafting these regulations, there's some things that we're going to, like with any kind of program, you're going to have some growing pains and figure out where the quirks are and say, okay, well, no car is built perfectly the first time it comes off the assembly line, and we're going to have to sort of work through those quirks of the program. So where we stand right now with the regulations is, as I mentioned back in the spring, this came across my desk. We had a number of iterations and drafts of the regulations. They're pretty straightforward. It talks about how you get certified, and that the office will certify, and that there's a registration system and a list that Karen touched upon. There's a method for decertification if you no longer qualify for the nutrient management requirements. And so, unfortunately, each state agency, including the Department of Agriculture, which is where we're housed, and the agency responsible for promulgating these regulations, has a regulations coordinator that works with the Division of State Documents and the AELR committee, which is, I can never get the acronym right, but I think it's the Administrative Executive Legislative Review Committee, that makes sure that the regulations are in proper format, that they, all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted. Our person left to the federal government a couple months ago. We had a temp in when we were getting ready to submit the regulations. The temp has now left, and so we're trying to get those submitted to the AELR committee before, I think it's the December 15th deadline, because at that point, the AELR committee says, we're coming up to the legislative session. We just don't have the manpower and the bandwidth to deal with the regulations unless it's an emergency basis. So we're racing up against that deadline. And so we're trying to get those submitted. I think, looking at the regulations, it basically, make sure that there is a process in place that, that Karen and, Mark are going to be able to hire these people, and they're going to be able to have a process where it's clear to farmers how they're going to get on this list and what their requirements are. And, hopefully we'll get those regulations in place. There's a notice and comment period. If anybody's interested, if we do meet the December 15th deadline, there'll be an opportunity to comment on those regulations going forward. It's not a fast process, but eventually we'll get them promulgated. For anyone who's interested in seeing those, the Maryland Register will publish the draft, and then any farmer or business that's interested in participating in the program can take a look at it. And we always welcome comments because we're not going to claim to be perfect, and we're not going to get everything right exactly the first time. And people who are going to participate in this market are going to know more than the lawyers. So please be on the lookout for those regulations, and submit any comments that you do have. Is there anything I missed, Karen or Doug Charkoudian, that you would want me to talk about?
No, I think, yeah, you did a good job. And, and I know this policy, this legislation was created based on a task force, but you can only think of so many things that might happen, right? And so the whole thing with the, the apiaries, that's been an interesting exercise. And, then also, how do we incorporate seafood? So
Right.
we're working through those programs. And, I think the key to all of this is having just really great communications with you, and then also our nutrient management staff too. Because obviously our intent is to, how can we help the farmers? We want to open up this market to the farmers. I saw, with the farm to school program, we have approximately 60 farmers selling to schools throughout the state. And then when you're looking at the potential of buying power that the state has, with its institution, it's pretty substantial. And so, ultimately we, as the Department of Agriculture, we want to help the farmers, and this legislation helps us. And just so I want to piggyback on that really quickly before we go to the other topic, is that we are going to have the Maryland's Best Buyer Grower Expo in January. And so that's a great opportunity, which we're going to be asking the institutions, the state agencies, to come and to talk to our farmers, because if we're going to have it in person, it's going to be in Annapolis on January 19th. So just keep that in the back of your mind. And I think I put something in the resource links about that. So it's another, it's a good opportunity to promote the program, and then also just the connection between the buyers and the growers.
Yeah, and let me just, one of the things I want to touch upon too is, I was reading the legislation last night. As Delegate Charkoudian mentioned, the state has money that it wants to use for local farmers. And, that's sort of the general nudge of the purpose of the legislation. But, working under the understanding that we also don't want to bind our agencies, that where I'm going here is there's a waiver and an exception process. So there are times where, and I'm trying to come up with an example, an agency is not going to be able to buy something local. And I don't let's say, for example, and this is just a wild off the wall hypothetical, the state prisons are going to, doesn't matter what agency it is, they can only buy pineapples, and pineapples are not grown in Maryland, right? Or whatever is not local. There's an opportunity for the state agency to go outside of the state, and they can ask for a waiver because the product's not there, or it's just way, outside of the, the pricing range of, what they could get somewhere else. So this just sort of came into my mind that, while there is an emphasis to buy local, the state agencies, whichever one it is, can say, well, we just cannot find pineapples in the state of Maryland, or, mangoes, or whatever fruit is not local, and we want to be able to go outside, and they can seek a waiver for that. So although there's a general nudge to buy local, it also gives some flexibility for the state agencies to go outside. So it's not going to be completely bound to the state of Maryland, or 50 miles outside of the state of Maryland, Pennsylvania, Delaware. So I just wanted to bring that up, that waiver process.
Okay, well, I'll jump in. I think I was going to move to another topic, but let me just say a few words about that if I could, which is that I think, yeah, if we're growing pineapples in Maryland, we've pretty much lost the climate change battle. So hopefully we're not going to be growing pineapples here anytime soon. But I think that certainly the bill has been written so that there is that flexibility, and you'll figure that out in the regs. But I do think the other thing that we'll find is that this is what I've said is sort of an iterative process. I think we do want to encourage potentially a shift in menus and meals to things that can be grown locally, right? I mean, I think there's a real question about, like, do we restrict ever buying pineapples? Probably not, but how much pineapple do we need in the menu, right? Like, that's an interesting conversation to have, in terms of the impact of, like, trucking our food miles and miles and miles. But I think the other piece of it is, I think part of what we find out when we say you have to try to get 20%, and people say, here's why we couldn't get 20%. We start to learn about, is it because, and I see the question in the chat, which is great, is it because the stuff isn't grown locally? Is it because it's not processed locally? Is it because you can't get enough of it? And so is that an aggregation and distribution challenge? And I think or is it a pricing point? And I think as we start getting the answers to that, like, as you know, the contractors, the prime contractor is forced to respond, not just to be like, yeah, we can't do that. Yeah, our supply chain is national, international. Sorry, we can't get you that. Is they're forced to actually engage and try to purchase from Maryland, from certified local farmers. Then we start to find out where the real barriers are. And I think for a long time, there's been sort of this chicken and egg conversation, and these conversations just lead to, like, let's just study it some more. So part of what we decided, as imperfect as this might be, is like, let's start doing it. Let's start forcing that conversation. Let's start forcing those conversations to happen. And we expect, at least in the short term, there'll be some additional local procurement. And over time, we'll learn more and more about what the other barriers are. And then we can respond to those with structural investments, like aggregation and distribution systems, and with additional policy procedures. So I'm going to shift a little bit to talking about the Food Resiliency Council, COVID, and some of the legislation that will be coming soon. So I think that the COVID experience has been devastating on so many levels, both from a health perspective, from losing so many precious lives in Maryland, from a economic perspective, just how much suffering there's been in Maryland. And then I think the other thing that's happened is it's caused us to really rethink a lot, and look at where our structures are, where our systems are, where things are that work, looking a lot at equity, looking a lot at supply chains, and looking at emergency preparedness. And so within all of that, I think there's been a lot of conversations about food and food security in particular. We've always had a probably shockingly high level of food insecurity in Maryland, especially for for our median income, for as well off as so much of Maryland is. Food insecurity is very high. And then I think during COVID, we saw really it tripled in a lot of places. And so sort of really looking at food insecurity issues, and then as we're looking at food insecurity issues, and I say we, I mean a lot of systems, a lot of agencies, a lot of elected officials, a lot of community-based groups trying to respond to local food insecurity. At the same time, looking at farmers who lost their prime markets at restaurants that they were selling to, and so really sort of seeing this thinking about structurally a food system and seeing where the disconnects were. And at the same time, as I said, the supply chain issues. And then in some places in the state, some really creative responses to finding ways to make sure all of our neighbors are fed, and creative responses among farmers themselves and among farmers with county agencies, state agencies, trying to figure out how to continue to sell to a market, and the role of this sort of farm to food security. And some of the work in those areas have been done by local food councils. And so in our conversations over last fall with local food councils, with a number of the state agencies, with MEMA, with the Department of Ag, we ended up deciding to create a statewide food resiliency council. And the thought behind a food resiliency council is that we're bringing together all of the stakeholders in the food system, wide range of folks, as well as a lot of the agencies. And even when everyone has the best of intentions, when we have agencies where, ag is responsible for agriculture and DHS is responsible for emergency food distribution and SNAP, and Department of Health is responsible for health, and really finding ways to support what can be sometimes siloed. MEMA, responsible for emergency response, right? Can be sometimes siloed. How do we coordinate the efforts, especially around something like food, which really touches on all of these parts of our agencies, and coordinate our efforts initially from the perspective of the emergency that really we still are in for all intents and purposes, an economic emergency and a food insecurity emergency. But also, how do we make sure the steps that we take right now are ones that build the kind of food system that we want long term? When we can respond to the emergency in a way that continues to just truck in, bananas and pineapples, or we can respond to the emergency in a way that continues to support the growth of our local agricultural system and responds to inequities in our food system in terms of where, communities where healthy food is very hard to get, and how do we respond in a way that really is responding to all of these structural problems. So we created the Food Resiliency Council that came into being in earlier this year. It was an emergency legislation, so I think it was June, or we started working on it. And MEMA is the primary agency. And really the group has hit the ground running and has produced a report. And I actually should have figured this out before I got on this panel, because I know that we signed off on the final report, and I think it's public now, but if it's not, it's going to be public in the next few days. And really a remarkable effort by so many agencies, so many stakeholders, nonprofit, farmers, people doing food advocacy work, people doing food insecurity, hunger advocacy work, emergency food responders, just really a remarkable effort. And this is the first report just came out, and additional reports will be coming over the next several years. The work will continue. So this was just the first report. And out of this report, I can share a piece of legislation that we're going to see, because I had said I would share the legislation that's coming, and I just pre-filed it yesterday. Senator Katie Fry Hester will be filing the same legislation. And what we're calling it is the Farm to Food Security Package. It's actually one bill with 3 components. So one component of it is, right now we have Maryland Market Money, which doubles the value of federal nutrition benefits like SNAP and WIC at farmers markets. And so it's a way to make farmers markets economically viable in areas that are otherwise food deserts. It's a way to make healthy food accessible to people using federal nutrition benefits, and it's a way to bring more money, both the state's money, the match, as well as the federal nutrition money, the SNAP itself, into farmers' pockets. And so that has been a very successful program, both here in Maryland as well as across the country. And so part of what this bill does is increase the state's annual allocation towards that program. The second thing the bill does is it creates a grant funding program for emergency food distribution places, so food banks or places that sort of function like food banks, grant program within the Department of Agriculture, so that those food banks can get grants to buy from Maryland farmers. So that can be contract growing, it can be surplus purchases, it can be farm box, like however it is that, and there was a lot of discussion about like what is the right model. The USDA farm to food box model left out a lot of Maryland farmers because of the structure of it. So we had a lot of conversations about like what's the right model to support that connection, and ultimately decided that it was appropriate for each community to figure out what its community needs most, and then to engage with the farmers to set that up. One of the conversations that happened was around culturally appropriate foods. There's a lot of conversation about, as we're doing emergency food distribution, what goes into those boxes and how culturally appropriate are they? How much is it consistent with how a community, how ethnic groups within a community are preparing food and feeding their families and their communities. And there's a real opportunity actually to now work with local farmers and educate around what are some of those foods that would have a real strong market, both from an emergency food distribution as well as in a farmer's market. And the hope is that part of what this program, so that's a conversation that happened within the Food Resiliency Council, and that this program would also support those conversations. And the last piece is to really build on the phenomenal work that Karen and her team have done around Farm to School, and the work that local school systems have done to really build build in Maryland food into school-based meals programs. And so, in a lot of conversations with local school system food. I'm blanking on the title. I'm so sorry. With the people who do the food service coordinators for local food systems. Did I get that right, Karen?
Yeah.
My apologies they do extraordinary work, by the way. So if any of them are on this call, thank you.
Yeah.
In conversations with them, the issue of where the challenges are, and sometimes the challenges in the federal reimbursement is so low for meals, which is a whole other thing that I'm not going to get on my soapbox on that about like what the federal government's willing to pay for the future of our country to get good nutrition. But putting that aside for a second, the federal reimbursement is so low, it doesn't give a lot of flexibility in purchasing. But also there's sometimes an additional cost to purchase local, but also sometimes it's additional costs that are related to storage or processing or staff time to engage with multiple local farmers. And so the bottom line was there is some additional cost to really doing that effectively, to bringing in local components. And so building on models that we have seen successful in New York State and Michigan and a few other states, we are creating a pilot grant program in Maryland that will allow school systems to apply for the equivalent of 20 cents a meal for a meal, 20 cents per meal for every meal that has a certified local farm enterprise farm product in it. So we're building on the system that we already have because it's procurement. Again, we have to be careful about how we set up the procurement because it's the school system's doing the procurement now. We have to set up procurement that supports all the constitutionality that our certified local farm enterprise program does. And but this gives that flexibility with 20 cents a meal. We're setting it up as a pilot for I think it's a 3-year pilot. With the hope that we'll collect data, we'll see how effective it is. And then in these other states, it actually has been made permanent and has been expanded. And so we really hope to get there in Maryland. But it's really building on the systems that we've already started to build. So that package is going to be called the Farm to Food Security Package. So look for it in a legislative session near you in January. Happy to work with anyone who's interested in that effort on it. And I think I will stop there. So see if there's questions I didn't know, Karen or Justin, did you want to say anything about the Food Resiliency Council or any of the other pieces before we shift to questions?
I'm good.
Oh, I see that you have the interim report. So excellent. That's available.
Also, yeah, I'm good. I have nothing to add to that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. That's really exciting to get a little bit of a preview on some pre-legislation that you filed. I do see a few questions in the chat box, so I'm going to go through those first. And anybody who's been thinking about it, please put your question in the chat box while we go over the first few. So one question about the state purchasing practices, this might be best for Karen, but does the state typically purchase raw goods, or is there some other sort of processing that is required beforehand to allow for institutional purchasing? And what kind of products or crops are most commonly sought out by the state?
Right. Good question. We're still gathering data. I know that there was a report that was created before the legislation was created, and that did a quick overview of how much food that is purchased through the state. And it's actually a combination of both raw products and processed products. So that's why, as part of this legislation, aggregation and aggregation and processing was included into it. So we're still trying to figure what that all means. For example, we know that the prisons do buy a lot of raw goods, which is good. They also have a processing, they also process meat too, local meat. And so right now, between the prisons and the hospitals, and then some schools too, because some schools are state run. And so we are trying to gather that information in conjunction with the other things that we're doing for the program.
Thanks. Let's see, we'll into the next question. Is there any conversation around, and I think Delegate kind of touched on this a little bit, but is there any conversation around incentivizing institutions to pay closer to retail prices for local foods as opposed to the wholesale price for local products purchased?
That's a question for me. I think, no, I think that there is, and I think that the conversation is around what is a fair wholesale price in Maryland. So I think the expectation is you continue to have wholesale prices in wholesale context and retail prices in retail context. But what we want to be cognizant of is, and this is this question about the or what I was saying about incorporating the externalities, right? Like internalizing the externalities of the impact on the Bay, for example. What we don't want is sort of this race to the bottom in pricing that encourages unsustainable practices or practices that are problematic for the Bay or so on. And so I don't think it's a question of asking institutions who are paying wholesale prices to pay retail prices, but it is a question of establishing what is an appropriate wholesale price and a fair wholesale price given all of the values that we have about what we want to support in terms of agriculture.
Right, and then also regarding that bill, the legislation that was created eons ago, like maybe 10 years ago, for paying 5% more, I think, for local products. Now, we don't have any data regarding whether or not that's utilized. I mean, that is available, and I guess trying to see if institutions do really utilize that as an opportunity to buy local.
Interesting. Did you have anything to add, Justin? If there's anything on the regulatory side that would have to be considered before trying to do to bring up the fair wholesale price?
I didn't see anything in legislation. I don't know of anything in the regulations that contemplates that concept. I mean, it wasn't something that I saw and I've really thought about.
Okay. Looks like we have another question come in from chat from Susan McQuilkin for the proposed legislation, the Farm to School Security Package and Pilot Grant. Would that be available to all Maryland schools or only to state or government-run schools?
No, it is all public schools. So the idea is that the previous bill that we passed puts a requirement on state institutions. It does not put a requirement on schools, which are not under state procurement rules. And so this is a way to provide that incentive for the schools to then also engage in the same process of buying from certified local farm enterprises, but it would be available for local school systems. And the way that we're envisioning it is that the local school system would figure out what they could do. So let's say one school system might say, we think through the month of September, we serve 10,000 meals across the entire school system in September, and we're going to put a local apple in every single one of those meals, right? So they could write a grant for.
Of course, I'm muted.
Hi.
Hi, sorry everyone. We had a minor connection issue, but I just have to say that I'm really glad that technical issue waited until the tail end of our conference and not in the middle. So I'm sorry to Delegate Tricudi. It looks like your last response was cut off in the middle there about responding to public schools or private schools being included in your pilot grant program. If you wanted to try to finish that response.
Yeah, I think I was just saying, I'm not sure how much of it you got, but like I was saying, so each school system can say, we're going to take 2 schools and year round, those 2 pilot schools are going to have local food, or we're going to take all schools in our system and breakfast in the month of September is going to have, an apple from a local farm. So they can figure out like what's doable in this pilot context, write a grant, pull that off, see how it works, and then potentially expand. So it's designed to be really flexible, because we want local school systems to find it as easy as possible to use it to experiment with engaging more with local farmers who they haven't been able to or have been challenged to purchase from for all the reasons that we've been talking about.
Gotcha. All right. Well, I think with that, we are at time. And I will go ahead and conclude the panel for today. I thank you so much, Karen and Lorig and Justin, for your insights today. I learned a whole lot, and so I'm really glad that you were generous with your time with our panel today. If anybody else has questions or wants to follow up, you can find the speakers' information in their profiles or submit questions to ALEI, of course. Please check out the resources that are attached to this session for more information on the suggestions from the Food System Resiliency Council and the Certified Local Enterprise Farm Program. I think I got that acronym right. So for everyone, thank you again for attending. Please keep your eyes open in your email for some post-event evaluation surveys. Those are very important for us to figure out how to do it better next year. So thanks again and have a great afternoon.
Great. Thank you.